Welcome to the Straight Talk Podcast, a place for learning, growth, healing, and solutions. My name is Tim Adams, owner of Tomato Systems, an audiovisual and leadership consulting firm. And today, in episode 4, we're going to start our conversation into stewardship by talking about the most obvious one, money. In my experience, I have found many situations where pastors, in an effort to attempt to be good stewards, focus on spending as little money as possible. They always go for the cheapest price. They always price check the bids that they're given. And there's wisdom in ensuring that you're maximizing the value that you're receiving, but there is also great folly in only focusing on lowest price, because generally speaking, lowest price also means lowest value. And specifically when it comes to audiovisual systems and just technology in general, generally speaking, you get what you pay for. And so when you focus on lowest price rather than highest value in the long term, sure, you may save money in the short term, but you're actually wasting money because you're having to repurchase a significant percentage of the equipment when it breaks or when it fails or when it doesn't do what you thought it was going to do multiple times over, let's say, a 10 or 15 year period, rather than spending a few $1,000s more, let's say, on a quality solution that is going to make it that 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So that's one thing. But I want to bring specifically to the discussion the parable in Matthew 25, 14 through 30, where this master is going on a long journey, and he calls 3 of his servants in, and he entrusts 5 bags of gold to one, 2 bags of gold to another, and to the final servant he gives 1 bag. We're all familiar with this. The first 2 servants double their investment, and they bring back, an amazing 100% return on their investment. So the first servant with 5 bags brings back 10. The second servant brings back 4 instead of 2. But the third servant buries the 1 bag of gold he's given. And then when the master returns, he brings that back. And it's quite interesting, this justification that he has. He says, "Master, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." And what's amazing to me is so much of the stewardship discussions that I have with pastors and with church boards and with just churches in general, there is a lot of fear of misusing funds or spending too much. And I'm not entirely sure where this fear comes from. Be that wherever it comes from, this is not only a discussion, but it's a battle that I have to fight over and over and over again. And specifically when it comes to tech. And it's something that really kind of confuses me, because when you need a new roof, you generally don't try and lowball the contractors that are going to put the new roof on. When you build a new church building or a new building, let's say maybe you're doing an expansion, you generally don't try and lowball and dictate what the price is going to be to your contractor, your general contractor. When your boiler goes out, you get what I'm saying, right? But with audiovisual and technology, somehow we have this idea in our heads that we can do it cheaper. And, I would really challenge that, because if you're only focused on lowest price, then there really is no purpose of contacting a system integrator or a consultant such as myself. Because we're going to be fighting you, and you're going to be fighting us the entire way. As soon as we submit a proposal or a bid or an estimate, all you're going to see is large dollar signs. And I've actually run into this, where I'll submit a bid and the pastor will come back and ask me to give them a discount. And not only is that unprofessional, it's extremely insulting. Like somehow I'm arbitrarily marking up the total in order to line my own pockets. And, I understand that there are sharks that prey upon churches in the form of system integrators and consultants. So there is a stigma in the house of worship market where they are taken advantage of. I've come in, sometimes pretty quickly after another larger company has done an upgrade, and I'm brought in to actually clean up their mess or fix a couple of things that aren't working correctly, because they came in, they did the work, and then they left. And the church has tried to get them to come back out to fix these couple of things, and they get ghosted. So I understand that, there are predatory practices out there. But to assume that I am operating my business in that manner is incredibly insulting to me, because I work very, very hard to be honest, to be straightforward, to do the very best that I can do on every project that I work on. So understand that just because you've had a bad experience in the past does not mean that it's fair that you as a pastor or you as a church get to project that onto people that you work with in the future. So I just ask that you bear that in mind. However, getting back to this parable, I think that there is a message here in this story that God gives us blessing in the form of, in the context of this discussion, in the form of financial means. And, tithes, offerings, regardless of whether you're a denominational church or non-denominational church, you are given money in order to utilize that money in a positive way, right? Now, you as a pastor have a very difficult job. And by extension, the leadership council, the church board, whatever governing body there is in your local church, you have an incredible responsibility. And that is to take that money and apply that to the mission. And the fourth part of this discussion about stewardship will be all about mission. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into that. But you have to decide how to divvy that money up in order to maximize the impact that you have. Churches have a very unique situation that they find themselves in. They're given money, and they're expected to provide a return on that investment, but in very non-traditional ways. So With a business or even a nonprofit, there are a lot more tangible ways of measuring the metrics of ROI. With a church, not so much. You might immediately think, oh, well, new members and baptisms and that kind of thing. And that's one metric, surely. But, another metric could be the amount of people that you reach online with your live stream, or with the content that you put out there. Another metric could be, how many kids did you have that came to VBS that are not members, that are not part of families already in the church? Maybe you're very evangelistic. Maybe you have a homeless ministry. There's lots of different metrics that you can use to measure your impact. And if you are not actively tracking that, if you don't have a mechanism for how to measure that, I would encourage you to meet with your ministry leaders and see if you can come up with that. Because invariably you're going to have members that pull you aside or schedule a meeting with you and, ask you point blank, and they're very direct and saying, I give, X amount of money every month or every year, and, where's that going? How is it being used? And wouldn't it be better to have an answer just ready to say, oh, well, I'm glad you asked, and this is where the money goes, and this is the impact it's having. So if you don't have that mechanism, I'd encourage you to explore that and see if that's something that can be developed. But I think one of the things that God is telling us, or Jesus is telling us in this parable, is that he expects those that are given financial blessing to utilize and make that money work. I mean, you look at the rest of this story, and the servant who didn't do anything with the money, he's like, and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's not a pleasant image. That does not sound like a place I want to be. And I think that there's also not only fear, but there's faithlessness that should be a part of this discussion as well. I've had the opportunity over the last 5 years to have fairly deep conversations with pastors in various churches within the scope of my work. And, we get to the point where I ask the question, like, do you really believe in God? Do you really have faith that when you need him the most, he will come through for you? And I don't think, at least in my denomination, which is Adventist, I don't think many people have challenged or asked a question like that, because the pastors that I've spoken to and asked those questions to, they're almost offended that I would ask that. But I think it's an important question to ask, because the Bible is full of stories of people having faith and God showing up and coming through. Now, he loves to wait until the last possible second to show up. But when he does show up, it's amazing. And you can probably think of half a dozen stories right off the top of your head where God showed up in a powerful way, just in the Old Testament. Now, obviously, there's dozens and hundreds of stories in the Old Testament of that happening. But the point is, that was not something that was reserved just for those times. That's something that is available to us now. But we have to be willing to take that step. There's a great analogy in the world of business, specifically entrepreneurship. And they say that being an entrepreneur, starting a business, is like jumping off a cliff and building a plane on the way down. And I think faith can be like that a lot, because there are times we feel a particular impulse or impression. Sometimes we may hear God speaking to us directly and telling us to do something that seems to fly in the face of traditional logic. And yet you can't shake it. But you're afraid to take that step. You're afraid of what people will think of you. You're afraid of the worst case scenario that can happen. You're afraid of, whatever it is. And I think those are situations and opportunities that God specifically orchestrates and arranges for, that allows us the chance to further our relationship with Him, to deepen our faith walk with Him. And sometimes He does that in order to get us off center, to get us into the game. As one person I heard put it one time, stop riding the pine. And this world that we live in is crazy. And I think it's important to understand that we're all created with very specific talents and gifts, and that's not by accident. Like, God expects us to use what He's given us. And, that's spiritual gifts, that's natural talents, that's, in this case, the money that is given. And I know in denominational churches it tends to be a little bit more difficult because, at least in the Adventist world, a significant amount of the tithe that is given goes to the larger organizational structure and gets dispensed from there. And so the amount of money that you send as a church may not, and often is not the same amount that you get back. Because the larger churches tend to help subsidize the smaller churches that are out in the rural area. And then globally, the more developed countries tend to support the less developed countries. And that kind of thing. So I love this parable because it it directly flies in the face of the kinds of attitudes that I often find in leadership. And it's largely fear-based. And, I love this phrase that you shall know them by their fruit, because it's so true. And I know that there's a specific context that phrase is part of. However, I do believe it is almost universally applicable into situations and contexts such as what we're talking about now. We're given money not to hoard it and not to be afraid of spending it, but in order to further the kingdom. And we shouldn't be afraid of doing that, because what I see are opportunities for us to step out and partner with God. But He wants us to take the first step. You take the first step, and then God oftentimes will bless that. Now, obviously, prayerfully consider, make sure that this is what He wants you to do in terms of a particular project or ministry or mission. But once you are certain, or fairly certain, that this is how He wants you, He wants you to invest the money, or utilize it would be a better word, then step out boldly. We don't want to be at risk of being Laodicea. We don't want to be lukewarm. We know that there are very strong words that God has said about Laodicea, and I think particularly right now, what we've been seeing over the last 3 or 4 years has been a significant shaking, and I think that shaking is going to continue. And I think that part of the purpose of that shaking is for us to figure out for ourselves once and for all where we really end up. Do we really trust the Father? Do we really trust and have faith that his heart towards us is good? And I think as pastors in particular, how and where we utilize the financial blessings that he gives us is very important. And I think that this parable in Matthew 25 shows very clearly that he expects us to use it, and to use it well. And in this case, we're not going to necessarily invest tithes and offerings and earn interest. I fully expect that he expects us to use that on mission and impact and growing the kingdom, period. The next thing I want to talk about is tithe, because there's a lot of attitudes towards tithe. I know that depending on the person, tithing can have several different looks. I remember coming across the idea of a sweat tithe, and the idea being that, well, I'm not going to give financially, I will give my time and my effort and my labor. And I don't know what I really believe about that. I know that is something that is mentioned in the Old Testament. I think ultimately tithing should be between the person and God. And I certainly don't believe or support the idea of church leaders going around to their members' homes and guilt tripping or stopping just short of extorting money out of these members. It is important that a church pay its bills and is as self-sufficient as possible. However, if we're utilizing those kinds of methods in order to do that, then we need to probably take a few steps back and ask different questions, such as, is this really something that God is in? We go back to that phrase, you shall know them by their fruits. Well, extortion, guilt tripping, that doesn't come from God. I'm sorry, it doesn't. And if you believe it does, then, we're going to disagree. There is nothing in Scripture that promotes this course of action. In fact, quite the opposite. Scripture says that we should give from a cheerful heart. And there is nothing cheerful about a heart that is being guilt-tripped or extorted or emotionally manipulated, anything like that. Period. There's no place for that in healthy relationships, be them platonic or romantic. There's no place for that kind of behavior inside the church. And I would say if there are church members actively engaging in that behavior, if you are engaging in that behavior, then there's some very serious discussions that need to happen. And it has nothing to do with tithing or financial matters. It has everything to do with where is your heart and where are you on your walk with God? Because what that tells me is that there are some serious issues going on in the heart that needs to get dealt with first and foremost. I know that Paul speaks very directly and very specifically about the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians, how they're so proud about how spiritual they are, and yet, they are allowing this man to live in sexual sin with his mother-in-law, with his father's wife. And then he lists about half a dozen behaviors that should not be tolerated in the church, and among them is abusers. So, not to, get on my soapbox, but I think that there's a lot of bad behavior that is swept under the rug. In fact, I know there is. And I would say quite strongly that if you're a pastor and you know that one of your deacons or elders or one of your leaders is maybe publicly an amazing pillar of the Christian faith, but personally inside the home, there's bad stuff happening, you have a moral and spiritual responsibility for dealing with that. And if you're not comfortable doing that, then we go back to where are you at in your walk with God. And, it's okay if you're not a confrontational kind of person. It doesn't necessarily have to be you. However, it does need to be addressed. And maybe that is better suited in a church board or leadership council environment. However you choose to deal with it, it does need to be dealt with. We've had far too much history in the church of treating people poorly. And I know a lot of that was, by a particular church in the Middle Ages, but, that doesn't let us in the Protestant churches off the hook either. The point is there is bad behavior and it needs to be dealt with. I think along the lines of tithing is there should be a focus on financial responsibility and maturity. That seems common sense, but this is all part of this larger discussion of spiritual walk and faith. I think that pastors have a very difficult job. In fact, I know you do. On the one hand, you have to be the spiritual leader for, sometimes thousands of people. And what that means is you have to model the behavior that you want to see. And that means that you need to have your personal finances taken care of. I know that, if you're a pastor of a smaller church or a startup church or a mobile church, and maybe you only have 20 people, it's going to be really hard for 20 people to pay the salary of a full-time pastor. I know that there are a lot of pastors out there who are primarily general contractors or landscapers. They have a full-time job, and then, for lack of a better way to put it, their hobby is to be the pastor of a church. That's their passion. But their church isn't large enough to support their pay full time. So I understand that it may be difficult, and it may look impossible to be financially responsible and mature. But that also goes back to your faith walk. And this is why I'm bringing faith into this discussion on money and within the larger conversation of stewardship, is because you as pastors have an incredible amount of responsibility in terms of shepherding your church members and your church. And I think in a lot of ways, church members have an expectation of perfection, or somehow you've achieved the Christian version of enlightenment, and you've got it all figured out, and you have all the answers, and they forget that you're a fallible human being first and foremost. and you have your own struggles. And, in a lot of ways, you get to the unfortunate reality is that you see your church members a lot of times when they're going through some very difficult times. When things are going well, they rarely make appointments to see you or have a conversation with you. It's when they're struggling or when they're in crisis that they think, I need this lifeline. And so in those cases, you have to be their rock, spiritually, emotionally, and that can get really tangled and complicated, because you find things out about these people that no one else knows. And you do have to walk a fine line. However, there is much opportunity for ministry, for encouragement, for inspiration, for prayer. I'm shocked the number of pastors that I've spoken to that don't immediately think, oh, this is a difficult situation, or this is an obstacle that seems insurmountable, and their first instinct is not to pray. It tends to be, okay, well, what can we do on our own in order to get past this? And I think, well, I truly believe that our faith journeys and our faith in general could be so much deeper and so much broader if we would simply go to God more often and more readily with everything. I know that my mom, for many, many years, she would get a particularly good parking spot outside a grocery store, and she would just send up a simple "Thank you, God," because it was an intentional effort on her part to keep God front of mind or top of mind, and at the forefront of her everyday experiences. And there are resources out there that can help you with that you can spread to your congregation. Something called the Pause app from Wild at Heart Ministries down in Colorado. They have this incredible app that reminds you 2 or 3 times a day to take a break and just go through a guided 1, 3, or 5 minute pause to center back on God and to make God center in your life, to make God center in that moment, and to remember that it's not really all up to you, it's all up to God. If we just open ourselves up and allow Him the opportunity to open the door, so to speak, to let God work in our lives. I think what we're going to close part 1 with is this idea of don't overdo it. As I started out saying, it's important that we think of stewardship correctly. And the way that I describe it is, good stewardship is about not wasting money, not about saving money. Because when you focus on lowest price, then that's all you're focused on. When you're focused on best value, what you're doing is you're looking at the long-term strategy, not the short-term. And generally speaking, 9 times out of 10, when you spend more money, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that much more, but when you spend a little bit more money, generally speaking, you're going to get a better solution. And when it comes to technology, I just going to get back on my soapbox here, because this is something that really does frustrate me quite deeply. When you need a new roof, you don't go and get a bid from a plumber, right? You get a bid or 3 bids from roofers because that's what they do. When you need service on your HVAC, you call an HVAC company. You don't call a carpenter. But somehow, for some reason, whenever it comes to technology, we have this tendency to try and undercut or go cheap because we have this either based on experience or this misconception that talking to a consultant or an integrator such as myself is going to cost a lot of money. And generally speaking, that's not true. With the larger companies, you're probably not going to be talking to them anyway because they're going to want to over-engineer everything. And the way that they operate is you pay them a certain amount of money in order to design the systems. And then if you end up going with their design and them and that company to do the integration, then whatever money you paid for the design is applied towards the total cost of doing the project. And generally speaking, those larger companies are not going to be looking at jobs that are less than 6 figures because it's frankly not worth their time. So with 80% of churches in America being 500 members or below, that is a massive segment of the house of worship market that's not really being properly served. And sure, you get those medium-sized companies that try and come in and capitalize on that. But as I explained before, their customer service and their follow-through is pretty dismal. That's not everybody. There are some really great companies out there. But you need to do your research before you just hire anybody. And that goes for, people who are churches that are looking at hiring us. We have a strong track record. We have clients that actively refer us. But you're not just going to hire the first roofer that you come across either. You want to make sure that they have good bona fides, that they have a proven track record of success. And you're not going to have to call them 19 times to come fix leaks that have sprung up because they cut corners and didn't do their job properly, right? Because it's a big headache for everybody. So when it comes to technology, it's important that you know what you don't know. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but hear me out. You hear the phrase, I know just enough to be dangerous. And we all kind of chuckle at that. It's kind of this inside joke, or it's not even inside. I mean, everybody kind of gets it. However, if you find yourself in that situation and you're looking at doing, a complete AV overhaul, or you're doing significant upgrades, like replacing speaker systems, audio systems, wireless microphones, cameras, projection system, whatever it is, lighting systems. If you don't know or have experience with designing those kinds of systems and that level of technology and how they all integrate together and have the resources and experience to know where to go for like wireless microphones, to say what frequencies are available and clear in my zip code or at this address for my church. If you know just enough to be dangerous, you really do need to reach out to a professional. And this goes right back to good stewardship and not wasting money. There are so many churches that say, oh, well, it's just a wireless microphone, so we'll just go to B&H, or we'll go to Sweetwater, or any of the other retailers, and we'll just buy a wireless microphone system because I don't need a professional to tell me how to do that and what I need to buy. I know what I want. I go and buy it. Okay, great. And then you spend the next 6 months fighting interference because you don't know what frequency that needs to be set to. Or the fact that every time you select a frequency, it interacts and interferes with another wireless microphone that you have. As an example, working with a professional doesn't have to be expensive. Obviously, it depends on who you choose to work with. But what you're looking for is somebody who is very committed to the long-term relationship. They're not what we call trunk slammers in the field. And, somebody who just shows up with a piece of equipment, sells it to you, slams their trunk, and leaves, and you never hear from them again. That's not who you're looking for. Who cares if it only costs you $150? When that piece of equipment starts developing issues, or when it breaks or fails, you're back to square one, because now you have to go and buy a whole new wireless rig. And if you keep focusing on lowest price, you're going to have the same result. And what's the definition of insanity, right? So it's important that you understand the difference between value and lowest cost, because ultimately, when you focus on best value, ultimately what you experience is saving money. So the end goal is the same. The difference is we fool ourselves into believing that when we cut corners, when we go for lowest cost, we're actually saving money. And if that's your attitude, you need to take probably 10 steps back from your situation, and you need to actually be very honest and look back over the last 10 years, 10, 15, 20 years, and look at all the money that's been spent on that particular solution. Now, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you'll find something on Amazon, you'll buy it, and it works great. But the percentage of times that happens versus the percentage of times that doesn't happen is inordinately unbalanced or imbalanced. So that is our discussion on the financial part of stewardship. Our next episode is going to be talking about how we be good stewards of people. And I'm very excited about this one because I got some good stories, and it's not a category that I think a lot of people think in terms of when it comes to stewardship. It's usually just about money. So I'm excited to dive into that one, and I appreciate you guys sticking with this podcast and listening. And if you have topics that you want us to cover, please let us know. Contact info will be available. And God bless. And we look forward to seeing you next time.